Hello everyone and welcome to another session in Who Wrote the Bible. In the first two sessions, we've been looking generally at the Old Testament, at the historical witnesses who over time bore witness to what God was doing, the way he spoke to his people through his prophets. And now we want to focus on particular prophets, particular books, especially those ones who over time have engendered some sort of discussion or even controversy about who wrote them. So we want to look at those discussions in this session and in the next session. So today we focus on the books written by Moses, traditionally ascribed to Moses, and the book written by the prophet Isaiah. So let's look first at the traditional views ascribed to these books. We're going to start by looking at the Pentateuch. That's the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Traditionally, scholars have said that these books were written by Moses, and there's some debate about when they were written. Some scholars ascribe it earlier, around 1400 BC, some later, 1200 BC, depending on how you read the archaeological evidence. So that's the traditional view. And with regard to Isaiah, generally speaking, around 700 BC. We'll look a little more about his exact dates later in the session. But just as a big picture, a general idea, those are the traditional views. But in both of those cases, over time, the scholars began to question some of those traditional views, at least some scholars. And so we want to look at those discussions, those controversies, what prompted them, how did they come about, and also how can we respond to some of those challenges. So we'll look through each of those cases. So let's start with the case of Moses and the Pentateuch. What really are we talking about here? Well, we said that while it was assumed throughout history that Moses wrote the Pentateuch around 1400 or 1200 BC, somewhere around there, there were some questions and some concerns. Let's look at a couple of those. One has to do with the report of the death of Moses. If you look at the last chapter of the last book of the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy, chapter 34, there's an account in there of Moses' death. And so this seems to be an interesting challenge for those who would say that Moses wrote all of the Pentateuch. How did Moses write about his own death? How did he write about his death after his death? Clearly, it creates a challenge for us to think about how Moses could have wrote about his own death at the end of his book. And in a similar way, there's this fascinating verse in Numbers chapter 12 that says, "Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth," which raises another question. If Moses wrote this, would he really write that he was the humblest man on all the earth? I mean, I suppose if it was true, he had to write what was true, right? But still, it does speak of Moses in the third person. Would Moses, as he's writing, speak in the third person about himself? Again, an interesting challenge. Also, we have various explanatory notes that are scattered throughout the Pentateuch about references to place names or circumstances. I mentioned here passages in Deuteronomy 2 where Moses is speaking in the first person. He's saying, God told me to do this or to go here, and we went there. So he's speaking in the first person. But then there's almost like a parenthesis, an editorial comment, almost we would call it a footnote, in which there's a statement about why certain places are called certain things and the way things used to be called. It's almost as if a later editor has come along and was reading these comments and wanted their readers to understand something more about the place names that Moses mentions. So another instance where we can say that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, but there seems to be these passages that doesn't seem, at least doesn't appear, at least at first glance, they would have come from the hand of Moses. Here's a couple other interesting facts. Sometimes when place names are mentioned, they're place names that seem to come from later in the history of Israel. For example, in Genesis 14:14, there's a reference to the city of Dan. But later, if we read in the book of Joshua or Judges that the word Dan, the city named Dan, was actually got its name much later. And it's because it's named after one of the tribes of Israel. So early on in the story, as early as Genesis 14, that particular place would not have been called Dan. And yet here it is, that name is used early in the story of Genesis. Moses did not cross over into the promised land. So how is he using this name Dan that comes along after the children of Israel actually wind up in Canaan? And there's another example in Genesis 36 that refers to Edom. The problem is when it refers to Edom, it also says that this happened after or before the monarchy in Israel. Well, the monarchy was still way off in the future as we look at the book of Genesis. It's talking about the days of King Saul and David. This would have been much later than Moses' period. So why is there a phrase like that talking about the future? It looks as if, again, at first glance, as if someone later in history is adding or amending or adding commentary, editing commentary for this particular passage. There's also an issue with regard to sources. As you read through the text, there seems to be some duplicate or maybe different, diverse views of certain events that happened. For example, the creation. There seems to be one story of creation in Genesis 1. And in Genesis 2, you get the same story, but from a different perspective and burrowing down maybe in the last couple days of creation. Why does that occur? And other stories, like the stories of the covenant, you have a whole telling of many of the laws in, say, Exodus and Leviticus, but then you get to Deuteronomy, and some of those same laws and some of those same traditions are recorded again. What do we do with these, what apparently are different sources or different descriptions of the same events? And then there are different names for God. Sometimes the name for God is the one we see here, YHWH. We pronounce it Yahweh. Sometimes it's pronounced Jehovah. It is that unique name of God that is revealed to Moses. And we see that all the way throughout Scripture, even before that name is revealed to Moses in the book of Genesis, for example. And then other times we have a different name for God, the more general name Elohim. Sometimes Elohim is used, sometimes Yahweh is used. Why these different names? What is the real name of the God that this person is writing about? Did different writers use different names for God? That's one of the questions that's asked. And also, of course, we have these stories that go before Moses. What about the story of creation? How did anybody get that information? How about the stories about the patriarchs, about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob? Those were all before the time of Moses. What sources did he use? Where did he get that information? So all these things, when put together, made some people begin to question. Well, we've assumed that Moses wrote all these books, but there seems to be some material in the context of these books, within these books, that at least at first glance, at first reading, doesn't appear like they came from the hand of Moses. So obviously over time, people began to ask these things, and as scholars became more and more emboldened to ask these questions, they began to publish works that asked these questions out loud. And so let's look a little bit at some of the history of these questions, some historic arguments on this in this regard. Now, the historic challenge to the traditional assumption actually comes from Jewish scholars. Without getting into a lot of detail of the long history, we'll kind of start, perhaps even arbitrarily, somewhere in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, in Spain, there was this tremendous birth of kind of a scholarly community. It was sometimes Jewish, sometimes Islamic. The two worked together in that community. It was like a renaissance almost in the medieval period of thinking and scholarly achievements. And in the middle of this think tank, so to speak, there's this wonderful individual, Abraham ibn Ezra. We'll hear about him again when we talk about Isaiah. And he looks at the Old Testament writings in Hebrew, the Tanakh, and he asks some of these questions that we just mentioned with regard to Moses. And he wonders out loud, how do we explain this? Now, he doesn't come right out and say that Moses didn't write them. He raises the possibility and he describes it as a mystery. And how do we get to the bottom of this? So it's really in the Jewish community itself that folks begin to at least ask the questions about maybe this traditional view needs some sort of editing. By the time we get to Spinoza, however, in the 17th century, he goes even further. He's from Amsterdam. He says flat out, Moses did not write them. This must have come later. Moses could not have written all this book that we call the Pentateuch. He just didn't. Now, Spinoza is an interesting character. Eventually, he questions the idea of God himself. Some people accuse him of being a pantheist, and in his day, the Jewish communities actually excommunicated him from the Jewish congregations. But here you have a scholar in the 17th century from a Jewish perspective that is just outright questioning the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. But in more modern times, those questions continued in the West as well, not just and in the Christian West, not just in the Jewish community, but in the Christian community. And this was a long time coming. You can go all the way back to the Renaissance, where humanism began to come into its own. This whole belief that humanity is a reflection of God, that human beings have this ability to think God's thoughts after him. And so there's this glorification, really, of the human figure, the human mind. These are the days where Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci created these beautiful works of art about the human being, celebrating the glory that is humanity. And it's a small step from that humanism to this idea of rationalism, that the human mind can think, the human mind can reason, that you don't need to resort to mystery, or you don't have to resort to speculation or superstition, kind of a wholesale rejection almost of the superstition and mythology of the medieval period. And we're going to think these things through rationally. And so the scriptures then, they began to look at them not so much as the mysterious work of God, but rather as a body of literature, as a body of text, like any other human text. And people began to apply that view for the scriptures. How do we look at the scriptures as just another human text, like so many other historic texts? And some of the names I mentioned here in the development of that thought, especially as it applies to the Old Testament, you have Astruc, Eichhorn, DeWitt, Graf, and Bellhausen. Those are the kind of the founders of this modern movement that began to question the traditional assumption with regard to Moses. I mentioned Friedman there. He is still very much with us, and he's publishing. He's a world-renowned scholar. I think he just came out with a book on the Exodus, the historic reliability of the Exodus. But he's someone who's for a long time kind of taken these modern challenges to the Mosaic authorship. He's also from a Jewish tradition, actually, and he is talking about those sources and how we can look at Moses and his involvement along with these other sources. And the theory that he propounds and the theory that comes out of this modern challenge period is a theory known as the documentary hypothesis, JETP. And I thought we might go over that a little bit, just so you're aware of what it is. If you go to most universities, most secular universities or colleges that teach history of the Bible, this is the theory that they're exposed to, that they're taught in some form or another. In some of the more progressive seminaries, this is taught. So we kind of ought to be aware of what it is. Basically, the idea is that rather than the entire Pentateuch being written around 1400 to 1200, it's really a product of later ages. And in some sort of outline, in some sort of way, it can be boiled down into these four groups of documents, if you will. One is the J document, and it is most of the material that uses that name Jehovah or Yahweh. wherever that name of God is used, it's kind of the earlier document, it is believed, and is really around the formative time. But rather than assigning that to Moses at 1400 to 1200, they see that as a later time, after the monarchy was established. Remember, I said that that was one of the challenges. Some of those comments seem to come later, after there's a kingdom in Israel. And that usually is associated with Saul, Samuel, somewhere in 1000 BC, something like that. And so the idea is that the first documents, the earliest documents, were composed just after the monarchy, around 950 BC, something like that. Then there's a second group of documents that uses this name of God, Elohim, predominantly. And this comes at a time where there's a ongoing challenges, the divided kingdom, coming into the divided kingdom, just before the kingdom divides. It has to do with the national interaction of the kingdom with other gods. And so that document is usually assigned just before the fall of the northern kingdom, around 750 BC. Then we have another group of documents, according to this theory, that come around the time of revolution, or I should say Reformation, around Josiah and other kings. So around 650 BC, something like that, where there's a reformation of Jewish practice, religious practice, legal practice. And so some of these laws, especially the book of Deuteronomy itself, they get put together later in this process. And then the last group of documents come right before the fall of Jerusalem, right before the conquest of Babylon. The idea there is that there's an internal struggle going on about who are the real priests in which families should be in charge. And so there's a lot of documents about the priesthood descending from Aaron and so forth. And so the idea is that the priestly documents, they're probably right before the fall of Jerusalem in 587. And then after the exile, after Babylon is conquered and the children of Israel are carried away to captivity in Babylon, then they settle down and began to assemble some of these documents into one collection that are completed kind of by the end, when the children of Israel come back into the land and begin to set up the temple. That by the end of, let's say, Malachi, somewhere like there, he's around 400 BC historically. They figure about then is when all the documents finally get assembled into what we see now as the Pentateuch. So that's the general idea. That's the general outline of JDP. And as I said, that's the majority opinion. Outside of conservative evangelical scholars, this tends to be the predominant view. So how do we respond to that? Well, let me just give a few thoughts about how I respond and my point of view. The first thing I would say is, let's not overreact one way or the other. I mean, I think sometimes we feel like we're caught in a dilemma. Like we either have to say Moses wrote every single word of the Pentateuch, and if we deny that in any way, somehow we're rejecting the divine inspiration of Scripture. So let's, first of all, set that aside. We don't have to go to that extreme. By saying that Moses is the author of the Pentateuch, we're not necessarily saying that he wrote every single word in the Pentateuch. We allow for the fact that later editors could have come along and added other material there. That doesn't deny inspiration. It's still God's God-breathed story. I mean, the Pentateuch itself is not claiming that Moses wrote every single word. Now, there are statements that Moses wrote this down, he wrote that down, these laws down, this account down. There are statements that Moses wrote some of it, but there's nothing in there about saying that he wrote every single word. And so let's not overreact and feel like we have to say to that extreme. We can allow editors and so forth and still see it as a divine work of God. Having said that, however, we don't want to go to the other extreme and say that none of this happened, none of this is historical. We don't want to go to the extreme that says, well, I know it says Moses did such and such, but he really didn't do it. It's mythology. It's later interpolation into the past. It's projecting back into the past. No, we don't want to go to that extreme either. I mean, the law of Moses says that Moses said this and did this and wrote this down. Well, he did. I mean, we're talking about facts here, actual history, not imagined history. That to me is the two barriers there, or the two borders that we want to put in place. On top of that, what about this use of sources? Well, again, the use of sources by itself does not detract from the inspiration of the scriptures. I mean, Moses certainly used some sort of source when it comes to the revelation of Genesis, the creation stories. I mean, yes, God could have communicated to him directly and gave him word for word these stories. But when we look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, for example, and see two different kind of varied perspectives on the creation, God could have worked through that process too. So it doesn't mean, again, it's not like he's inventing facts or he's repeating history or fantasy. He's repeating history. Those sources happen to be true. So the use of sources in and of by themselves does not detract from the inspiration of God's law and the Torah. And the other important truth here we want to point out is that when it comes to this JEDP theory, there's no real documentary evidence to support it. I mean, these supposed documents, the J document, E document, the different structures, orders, we don't really have any documents like that. The earliest documents we have, the Old Testament, are the ones that we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they all represent entire books, if you will, not fragmented books where some pieces of J, some pieces of E. We don't have that. And also, by the way, the Septuagint that we went over a couple weeks ago, this Greek translation that also happened about the same time in the 1st or century, 2nd century BC. We don't have any evidence. So the theoretical documents, JEDP, there's no documentary evidence of that. The only documentary evidence we have is of the whole thing. Now, admittedly, it's 1st or century, 2nd century BC, 100 BC, 200 BC, maybe a little bit older than that. So certainly, even JEDP says it was completed by 400, some 200 years earlier. Well, let's just be clear, there is no documentary evidence in itself supporting that theory. And I would go even a step further. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that these documents were kind of combined. The Pentateuch was put together somewhere in that 400 BC area. Even if that were true, to me, it's kind of a stretch to see how we got from 400 BC to 200 BC or 100 BC, 200 or 300 years. And by that point in the history of time, the Pentateuch is seen as the law of Moses. It's regarded as the law of Moses. It's believed to be written by Moses with the authority of Moses. We saw the stories surrounding the Greek translation, the Septuagint. We saw the sacredness with which these books were handled. That can only be explained by realizing that by that point in time, by 200 BC, 100 BC, people revered these works in their entirety. It's hard to see how, if it were compiled by these anonymous editors somewhere along the line without names, cobbled together by editors, no matter how worthy, that a whole generation of people would look at that as holy, divine, inspired work. So, in balance, then, I would say the preponderance of the evidence argues for the unity of these 5 books. And if there are unity of the books, there's nothing in and of itself that suggests that they had to be written later than when tradition says they were written by 1400. However, we do acknowledge at the same time that there probably was some editorial work that happened later in time after the monarchy took place, where editors went back through and clarified some of what Moses had left. I see no problem with that. That clearly seems to be the best explanation, but that does not detract from the inspired nature of this work. This is still God-breathed story, and it still gives us actual historic fact. The whole reason why editors are there adding information is to make it clear that this is actual historical fact. This is not made up stuff. This is things that Moses actually said, Moses actually did. So that's my perspective on the Moses story. So let's kind of go back here a little bit, and let's now jump into the Isaiah story here. What's going on there, and why are there discussions and controversy around Isaiah? So let's first look at the literary challenge. Why is there an issue with regarding that? As I said, the traditional view is that Isaiah wrote this somewhere in the 8th century, the turn of the 8th century, around 700 BC. Here we can see his exact dates. His exact dates are somewhere around 740 to 685 BC. So that's the area of his ministry, and you can see we have a little table here that shows that he served under 5 different kings of Judah. Now remember, at this particular time in Israel, there are 2 kingdoms, not just one kingdom of Israel. The kingdoms have actually been divided into 2. The united monarchy that happened under Saul and David and Solomon, now the country had split in 2. The northern part of the country was called Israel, and the southern part of the country was called Judah. And Isaiah worked mostly in that southern half, the southern part of Judah, and there were 5 kings under whom he served during that particular time. In the north, there were 2 kings through this time. They had a more stable leadership. The problem is, however, that their days were numbered. And while Isaiah was still prophesying, still in his ministry, the northern kingdom falls. The Assyrian Empire invades the northern section of Israel, conquers it, takes the people captive in 722 BC. So by the end of Isaiah's ministry, there is no more northern country called Israel. There's just the southern country called Judah. And that happens all as a result of the invasions of Assyria. And you can see I've listed out some of the emperors that were around at the time of Isaiah's ministry. So historically, that's when Isaiah lived. That's what he witnessed firsthand. Now, if we dig a little deeper then, let's look at some of the key dates then that are surrounding this book. The first 3 we kind of already mentioned. Isaiah is called to ministry somewhere around 740 BC. And then this terrible event of Assyria coming in, and as part of God's judgment on the northern kingdom of Israel, they conquer Israel, take captives, destroy that northern kingdom. And then in 685 is the date that we normally ascribe to the prophet dying. However, there's 2 other important events on the horizon, and they're going to be important here in a moment, but let's just lay them out on the table first. In 587, 586 BC is a critical date in the history of Israel. It's when Judah falls to Babylon. A new empire will rise, the empire of Babylon. Just as Assyria comes in and destroys the northern kingdom of Israel, Babylon is going to ascend. They're going to come and destroy the southern kingdom of Judah and destroy Jerusalem and the temple in the mix. But then, in about 70 years later, a new empire will rise, the empire of Persia, and they're going to give permission to the captives of Babylon to return and rebuild the temple. And that whole process begins around 538 BC with the Persian emperor Cyrus. So I point those dates out because these dates are all discussed in the book of Isaiah. If we look at roughly kind of breaking down the story of Isaiah, the text of Isaiah, the first 39 chapters all deal with admonitions and events that happened during Isaiah's lifetime. And you can walk through those. But when you get to chapter 40, there's a different perspective. There's a lot of talk about Babylon and being in exile in Babylon. And the challenge there is Isaiah is no longer alive by that point. He dies in 685, but Judah doesn't fall to 586. And so how is he talking about Babylon and being in exile in Babylon when he's not experiencing this? Let alone the later sections that talk about returning from exile and what goes on there. So a lot of talk of future events after the dates of Isaiah. In fact, it even goes deeper than that. Isaiah gives specific predictions. Now, some of them occur while he's still alive. For example, this first prediction that I mentioned here, he predicts ahead of time in Isaiah chapter 7 that Assyria is going to come destroy Damascus and Israel. It hasn't happened yet this early in Isaiah's ministry, but Isaiah is looking ahead. And sure enough, by 722 BC, that prophecy is fulfilled. So we have this expectation setting going on. God is giving prophecies that will be fulfilled in the short run, so that when they happen, people can look back and say, yeah, God said he was going to do that through the prophets. So Isaiah is prophesying what will happen in the future. Well, as the story unfolds throughout Isaiah, even further ranging prophecies happen. Isaiah is seeing things further out in the future. God is giving him visions of things that happen out in the future. For example, in Isaiah 47 and in other places, I just gave you this text, Isaiah sees explicitly that Babylon will come and take Judah captive. And that doesn't occur until many years after Isaiah dies. And even more famously and remarkably, way before Cyrus is even thought of, imagined, a gleam in his father's eye, if you will, well before that happened, Isaiah names him by name as the one that God will use to restore the people after the exile. So extraordinary detail about what will happen off in the future. And so these specific elements are given. Now let's back up for a moment. Remember what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a period of time where people are looking at the scriptures now as normal human documents. How do we explain that? That there's prophecy in here about somewhere out in the future after Isaiah is actually alive. How do we respond to that? Well, again, historically, the challenges start inside of the Jewish community. And again, we have those folks that are active in and around Spain in the 11th and 12th centuries. This is where the questions begin. And again, our friend Abraham ibn Ezra is the one that kind of goes on record and saying, listen, we need to think about whether Isaiah wrote every single word in Isaiah. He's dealing with things that happen out in his future. So from a purely human perspective, it doesn't really appear that Isaiah would have written these things. So again, what began as a Jewish controversy in the Middle Ages, as it develops in the West, especially among Christian scholars, those theories are developed. So at first, it's a to Isaiah kind of phase. It's recognized that one group of writings, that first section from 1 to 39, appear to talk about Isaiah's own time during his time in Judah before his death. But this second group of material, the material from Isaiah chapter 40 on, the one that deals more with the Babylonian exile and later with return, that might have been a second Isaiah, perhaps also named Isaiah. So there's really two works, two Isaiahs, if you will, that later get combined into one book. But then that theory is developed further, and you have scholars coming along in the 19th century that look at that and say, that last bit where we're talking about Persia and the return of the exiles, a lot of that language seems to indicate that it comes from Judah. Like people were actually referring to Judah's time frame, Judah's geography, Judah's worship practice. So there's a piece that seems to be written after the children of Israel came back into their Holy Land. And so they suggest three Isaiahs. One from 1 to 39, historic Isaiah there in Judah. A second section that is written by a different Isaiah during the time of the Babylonian captivity. And a third Isaiah that now writes after the return. More recently, there seems to be another group of folks into the 19th and 20th century, and this is probably prevalent in many schools right now. It's that this is really about the school of Isaiah. It wasn't about individuals, one Isaiah or two Isaiahs or three Isaiahs. That probably there's a school of Isaiahs, a school of editors, a group of editors that over time have cobbled together these various writings ascribed to Isaiah and put it into one book. So that's another way of explaining why we have these different historical perspectives. So again, let me just give a few responses to that, and it's just my 2 cents. And again, I want to emphasize that we don't want to overreact here one way or the other. By saying that Isaiah is the prophet, we don't mean to say he wrote every single word and every single phrase that we find in the book by his name. We're allowing the fact that editors or secretaries came along and could write about Isaiah in the third person. So that doesn't detract from God's story. It doesn't detract from the history. But we would say that whenever the text says Isaiah said this or did this, or he's speaking in the first person, it happened. It's history. It's not mythology. It's not read back into the past. It actually happened the way it says it happened. So Isaiah is certainly responsible for the majority of the content that is bearing the book, for the book that bears his name. The other thing we have to insist on here is that we allow prophecy to do what prophecy intends to do. And this zeal to go back and see the book as a normal document, as a normal human document, we can do that, but we can't eliminate the reality that God uses this prediction of the future as part of his story. I mean, it's all essential to the whole argument of the book. I take this text from Isaiah 44 that says, "Who carries out the words of his servants and fulfills the predictions of his messengers?" This is a central message throughout the book. The idea that God can do what he says he's going to do. When he gives his messengers a message, he does that. And the whole point is to say that up front, to tell people years in advance about Cyrus, about destruction. He does that over and over again so that when it happens, people are sure that this is God's doing. This isn't an accident of history. This isn't a mistake. This is God predicting what will happen so that when it occurs, people say, wow, God said this was going to happen. He does what he says he's going to do. And those early prophecies, for example, the one where he talks about the fall of Assyria, or also in Isaiah chapter 7, when he talks about a son being born. On one level, it happens early. It happens in Isaiah's own lifetime, so that there's a short distance between the prophecy and the fulfillment. But then there's also prophecies. It's like God is getting us ready for longer range prophecies, longer range predictions. So in Isaiah 7, yes, it's fulfilled. There's a child promised. On one level, it's fulfilled in Isaiah's lifetime through his own son, whom he bears with his wife. But also it's a prediction of Jesus that comes centuries later. This prediction about the fall of Assyria, it's now going to be magnified when he talks about now. You thought that was good, that I could predict the fall of Assyria in a short period of time. Now he goes on record. Before Babylon was really a country that had to be dealt with, before Babylon was a threat at all, before Persia was even on anyone's horizon as an empire, way before any of this happened, God goes on record, puts in print, this is what's going to happen. A fantastic, absolute fantastic prediction. Not just the captivity, not just the destruction of the temple, but also to go beyond that and say, and the people will come back by this person named Cyrus. I mean, this is part of the whole argument of the book, that God is making this argument to his people ahead of time. So we're not willing to let go of that prophetic piece of this book, that God can and does give visions of the future that do in fact come place. We can't rule that out in terms of the way God reveals himself. Again, with regard to manuscripts, I give you a little picture at the bottom. That's a picture of a script that is found, a scroll that is found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the earliest copy we have, Hebrew copy, of the whole book of Isaiah. And here again, from the 2nd century BC, 200 BC, something like that, maybe earlier than that, but certainly 200 BC, around there, we have this entire document, this entire book of Isaiah. So whatever edits would have happened, it couldn't have happened later than that. I mean, some of the early theories assumed that Isaiah was cobbled together somewhere in the 1st century AD. Well, that clearly can't be the case. We found an entire document. Again, it's not, we don't have any evidence of one section of Isaiah being kept as a separate document from the second section. They're both in the Septuagint and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're seen as one document. And the last argument I would put forth is this idea that really, if you stand back and look at the whole argument of Isaiah, the first section and the second section go together. The two are basically building on one another. Scholars have gone back through and saw, for example, there's more arguing for the unity than arguing for the division. For example, I'll just pick one example. One of the names for God that Isaiah uses is the Holy One of Israel. Well, that occurs some 12 times in the first section of Isaiah and 14 times in the second. So there is this same name for God that doesn't appear anywhere else, but appears in both sections of Isaiah. Just one instance of many ways in which it looks like the same author was the author of both. So the way that the book unfolds, the story that's being told is an integrated story. In fact, some scholars who try to argue for multiple editors are astounded by the quality of the editors. I mean, the editors have done, in their opinion, a marvelous job making it appear like one story. I would argue that the reason it appears as one story is because it is one story by one author. And as we close out this, I do want to look at one text. Let me just look at one text from Isaiah chapter 39. So let me just put that in here. And let me just read that chapter to you. It's a very short chapter. And the story is a transition. It's the end of that first part of Isaiah, the first section, and it's the section in between. It's the transitional chapter. It says, at that time, Marduk-Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift because he had heard of his illness and recovery. Now, at this point, Babylon is a small nation. It is a client nation of Assyria at this point when Hezekiah is king. It's not a threat to Judah. And so this king who's seeking to build alliances with fellow enemies of Assyria comes to Hezekiah and Judah to become an ally against Assyria. And he comes, and there is this story earlier in Isaiah of Hezekiah's illness. Anyway, he comes with this gift, this kind of ways of building this alliance. And the text says that Hezekiah received the envoys gladly and showed them what was in his storehouses: the silver, the gold, the spices, the fine olive oil, his entire armory, and everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his palace or in all his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. So here Hezekiah is showing this king of Babylon at this point all his wealth, all his riches, and kind of showing him where he keeps all the expensive stuff, all the expensive jewelry, all the expensive silverware, right? He shows this king of Babylon. And then the chapter goes on and says, then Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and said, what did those men say, and where did they come from? From a distant land, Hezekiah replied. They came to me from Babylon. And the prophet asked, what did they see in your palace? They saw everything in my palace, Hezekiah said. There's nothing among my treasures that I did not show them. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all your predecessors have stored up to this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, will be born to you, will be taken away, and that will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And then Hezekiah's response, the word of the Lord you have spoken is good. Hezekiah replied, for he thought there will be peace and security in my lifetime. Great leader, right? He's thinking of himself there. But you see how integral this chapter, this transitional chapter. Isaiah actually pulls it out of his historical sequence to put it at this place in the text. He's building a foundation for what is to come in the following chapters, this time of captivity under Babylon. The idea here is that Babylon, that fulfillment that was at the time when nobody would have suspected Babylon to be an empire, it will become an empire. So you can see that chapter 39 is an intricate part of the bigger picture. It's laying a foundation for the next picture. So it's just another argument to show that the text as it stands is telling one story. So again, on the whole, I would say that the arguments for one story and one author are much stronger than the arguments for multiple stories and multiple authors, on balance. And I say this as somebody that didn't just try to repeat the tradition. I'm not just trying to find ways to prove the traditional opinion. Having studied this and worked through, I want the truth. I want to know what actually happened. I want to know if this word in front of me is a believable text. And it seems to me that if you are willing to accept the premise that God can and does reveal the future through his prophets, that that's part of his way of communicating his people, and on the larger scale, that makes sense in the big story of God. That is the way God is getting us ready for the coming of his Son. It seems to me that on balance, if you are willing to accept that supernatural kind of assumption that God can and does do that, then the arguments for the unity of Isaiah are much stronger than the arguments against it. So what is our conclusion then? We just put this out. While many alternatives have been proposed to the traditional views that both Moses and Isaiah are responsible for the works bearing their names, it seems to me that none of these alternatives have demonstrated their cases beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, once you're willing to accept the fact that God can and does reveal himself through these authors, there are literary challenges, there are questions being posed. I think we're justified in looking at those. And as I said, in the end, we are willing to admit, and it seems logical to admit, that some editorial work has gone on in these texts. But in the long run, that doesn't detract from the inspired nature of these texts. God is still telling his story. But what we're unwilling to do is kind of disregard these stories as mythology, as made-up history. No, these are historic works. God actually worked the way these works say it happened. God is giving us a foundation in history. He's giving us living flesh and blood examples of what he's doing in his world, preparing all of this for the coming of his Son. So that's my conclusion. That's my recommendation. Take it or leave it, however you want. But I did want us to be aware of some of the discussions that are out there. Make sure you come back next week. We're going to look at the prophet Daniel. That's another book that's created a great deal of controversy and a great deal of discussion. So we're going to look at that a little bit, and hopefully we'll have time also to take a look at the book of Esther. So that's our agenda for next week. We'll see you next week here in our course, Who Wrote the Bible?